Hi, everyone. Good morning. Okay. My name's Bethan. I'm Senior Policy Specialist here at ZSL, which means I work on all things climate and nature policy. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what that means, why it matters, and a little bit how it links to innovation. So I hope this will sort of set the scene a little bit for you for the rest of the day. So the first thing is probably just to explain a little bit about how ZSL works. We're 200 years old. It's our 200th birthday next year. There will be a party. You are, of course, invited. And ZSL is made up of three key parts. The first you've probably heard of, London Zoo and Whipsnade Zoo. You're here in London Zoo. So these are our sort of public, most well-known public-facing entities. We invite 2 million people into the zoos every year. Just today, there are over 1,000 school children here engaging with the site and all of its wonderful animals and conservation projects. But in addition to our two zoos, we have our Institute of Zoology, which is in the building like directly next door to where we are right now. And this is a permanent research hub with permanent staff and researchers that work on all things climate change, ecology, zoology, science, research, publications, and just really, really awesome science that spans everything from the smallest species through to the biggest ecosystem. And finally, we have our Conservation and Policy Department, so that's where I'm based, but we also work across the organisation. And Conservation and Policy represents all of ZSL's advocacy work, so how we try to influence decision-making on the world stage, but also our field programmes. So ZSL has permanent offices in 7 countries across the world, mostly in Africa and Asia. And if you add all of our projects up across the Institute of Zoology and Conservation and Policy, we have approximately between like 110 and 130 countries that are being used for projects every year. So I think it's like 150 projects over 120 countries or something like that. So our reach is very, very broad. So for ZSL, what we care about is making it's too early in the morning to be giving a presentation, obviously. The thing that we care about is trying to make the world safer and better for nature and people, because obviously they are interconnected. The problem is we have some really key challenges. Many of you will be aware of this, but I'm just going to set the scene a little bit. So this is what we call it in policy circles, a very swanky term, the triple planetary crisis. So that's the interlinkages between climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss. And obviously all three of these things are intrinsically connected. Our job here at ZSL is to think about how can we be tackling these issues so that wildlife and people can thrive. You may have seen this before. This is called the climate stripes. I see a little bit of nodding, but essentially this is a visual representation of increasing global temperature. So at the start is 1850, and at the end is 2023. There is a more recent one from 2025, but I just couldn't find it. And this shows a sort of visual representation of average temperature rise since 1850, which obviously shows a drastic increase in temperature. Then at the bottom, this one you probably haven't seen, it's a little bit less well known, but this is a decrease in biodiversity worldwide. So we're going from green back in 1970 all the way through to grey in 2018. And this represents a 72% reduction in biodiversity, what we call biodiversity abundance. So biodiversity abundance is a bit of a funny term, but what it means is you're not just looking at the number of species in the world, but you're looking at the number of individuals that make up that species group. So for example, if you had only 2 Sumatran tigers, you'd still have Sumatran tigers, but you want thousands of Sumatran tigers, right? You want an abundance of tigers. And this represents a decrease in abundance. And it's interesting because these two things are, as the sort of data somewhat represents, intrinsically connected. This is another representation of that. This is the saddest, but also most interesting graph. I love graphs. What this is representing is the correlation between temperature rise and species loss. So you can see that as the temperatures rise up to 4 degrees, we are risking a loss of up to 100% of some species across the equator. So it's a really extraordinary amount. But we also know that if we limit temperature rise, that the loss is less, right? So that's the job. We've got to keep the temperature rise as limited as possible. And then this is the same representation. So this is the species loss from 1970 through to 2020, 73%. The question is, what's causing this? What's causing this decrease in biodiversity, this decrease in animals and plants around the world? Well, there's a few core reasons. These are the sort of the top 5. Habitat loss, so that's things like caused by things like deforestation or building of human infrastructure, essentially just the loss of the natural world. Climate breakdown, so that's climate change. Many of you will know that one. Unsustainable exploitation of species, that's essentially saying humans using too much of the natural world. Invasive alien species is a fun term, but essentially it means diseases, pathogens, animals and diseases that are turning up where they shouldn't be, which is being exacerbated by these other issues. And finally, pollution. So that's things like plastic pollution, which many of you will know about, but also air pollution and other types of pollution as well. So here at ZSL, we know these are the core drivers. We know this is what's causing the trouble. So our job is to try and find solutions to these problems. Now, there's lots of different ways that we can solve these issues. These are what we call systemic issues. They are across the whole of society, and they're really, really big. And one organisation or one person can't solve them alone. So we have to think about how do we enable systemic change. Now, the way I like to think about this is that we need to think about moving from green to grey, which is the way we're going at the moment. We're losing abundance, to flipping the picture, my very swanky animation here, from grey to green. How do we flip it so that we're restoring nature? And like I said, there's lots of ways to do this. The way I like to describe it is I want to imagine a chair, a little 3-legged stool. And on the top of this chair is the thing you want to change. That can be anything. It could be you want to work on how do we make housing more efficient? How do we stop people being so hot in the summer like we are now? How do we build more efficient buildings? It could be how do we solve conservation challenges? It could be how do we decarbonize the economy? How do we move to a net zero economy? It could be how do we save a species? It could be how do we innovate in business? It could be anything. Imagine the thing you want to change. That's the little star on the top. And for change to be effective, you need 3 things, the 3 legs of the stool. You need business change. So you need businesses to change the way they think, to change the way they act. You need people to change, so that's behaviour change. And you need policy, so you need decision makers to make laws and regulations that work for people, planet and biodiversity. The problem is, if you only have 2 of these, the whole thing topples over and your systemic change isn't going to happen. You have to have all 3. But the reality is no single person or business or institution or even a great charity like ZSL can do all 3. We can't. We have to work with others and we have to build the biggest team in the world to try and solve these issues. But we can choose the thing we want to focus on. And for me, the thing I've always been really interested in is policy and decision making and how change happens and also what stops it from happening. So for us at ZSL, we look at how can we influence decision making. Now, policy is a funny word. A lot of people use it for a lot of different things. But essentially, it's what governments choose to do or not do. So not making a decision and not doing something is also a policy choice. And we work at different levels. So we work in Parliament. I actually used to work there in an old job. That was my old office. We work at the UN level, and we also work at the local level. And this means that, just 2 weeks ago I was in Germany for a UN conference where we were trying to do work on how do we influence climate change decision-making at the global level. And then this week I've got colleagues in Parliament working on how do we influence more local and granular decisions that are being made. But there's lots of different ways to do it. That's kind of the point I'm trying to make, is that there isn't just one thing you have to do. There's loads of different options. Because the reality is we don't just need people like me working in policy. We need people who are dedicated to building sustainable businesses. We need people who are going to build social justice movements. We need people who are going to be doctors and lawyers and innovators and entrepreneurs. We need people who are policy people like me, but that's not the only choice. In essence, what we need is a diverse group of people who are dedicated to systemic change, to building that chair that doesn't topple over. The thing I wanted to end with, my final few lines, is that when I see a lot of younger faces here, and it's lovely to see you, when I was in my secondary school ages, as I'm sure many people here experienced, everyone would ask me what I wanted to do with my life. And I had no idea. And in a way, I still don't. The thing that I did know was two things. Firstly, I knew what made me angry. I knew what made me look at the world and think I want to change that, or that makes me so angry that that there's injustice, or there's unfairness, or that there's climate change, or that there's all of these things. I knew what made me angry, and I knew what I was curious about. I knew that when I looked at the world, I was fascinated in the natural world. I knew I was fascinated by people and the decisions they made. I knew those things, and that's all I knew. I didn't know if I wanted to be a doctor or a lawyer or a politician. I didn't know, and I think that's okay, because I think a lot of people expect us to know. And not knowing is fine, and it's good. But knowing what makes you angry and knowing what makes you curious are really useful tools in thinking about how do you want to look forward to your life, to your future, and think about the things that you're curious about and want to change. So, I'm going to leave it there. I hope that's an interesting, framer for the rest of the day, and could get you thinking about not only the problems that we're trying to solve, but the role you can play in making them a reality. Thank you.